Hey, this is Robert, and I'm at the Salem Media Group today. I'm getting ready to go on the air in a few minutes, and I got a good show lined up for you today. A lot of important issues, particularly if you're in the state of Florida. I'm going to start out with the Hepatitis A outbreak, and I have a fantastic guest on today. It's epidemiologist with the DOH. Her name is Andrea Leapley, and she'll be giving us the ins and outs of what's going on with the Hepatitis A outbreak, particularly in the Tampa Bay area where we're being hit extremely hard. And then in the second half, with June 1st right around the corner and hurricane season, Avian Flu Diaries' Mike Coston will be on the show to give us his vast knowledge of hurricane preparedness. You don't want to miss it. And as always, I appreciate you listening and following the website and watching us on YouTube. And again, thank you and God bless.
This is Outbreak News This Week, brought to you by the Global Dispatch Incorporated. Outbreak News This Week is your source for all the news about worms and germs. And now, your host, microbiologist and editor of OutbreakNewsToday.com. Here's Robert Harriman.
Well, good day, Tampa Bay, and welcome to your source for all the news about worms and germs. And as always, I encourage you to check out the website, OutbreakNewsToday.com, OutbreakNewsToday.com. And we're going to be looking at some Florida topics today on the program. And the CDC reports that since the hepatitis A outbreaks were first identified in 2016, more than 17,000 cases, and about 6 out of 10 of those required hospitalization, and about 170 fatalities as a result of hepatitis A virus infection have been reported. Huge amounts. Now, last year, Florida became one of the, I think it's around 24 states now that are reporting an outbreak. And so far this year, the numbers continue to rise. So what is hepatitis A? And what is the situation in Florida? Well, joining me to discuss this is Andrea Leapley, MPH. Andrea is the regional epidemiologist and laboratory liaison with the Bureau of Epidemiology at the Florida Department of Health. Hi, Andrea. Welcome to the show, ma'am.
Hi. Thank you for having me.
You bet. Well, let's go ahead and start out with a little primer for the audience. What is hepatitis A?
Hepatitis A is a contagious infection of the liver caused by the hepatitis A virus. It's spread when a person ingests the virus, which can occur through close personal contact from someone with hepatitis A, such as caring for someone who's ill, or through sexual contact. But it can also be from objects that are contaminated by small and undetectable amounts of stool with the virus from an undetected person that's then touched and ingested by another person.
And what kind of symptoms might you see with hepatitis A?
Hepatitis A symptoms include nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, abdominal pain, jaundice, dark urine, and clay-colored stool.
Yeah. Now, how long after you're exposed do the symptoms actually develop or appear?
On average, symptoms develop about 28 days after exposure, but it can range from 15 to 50 days.
Yeah. Now, there's a big outbreak going on around the country. Who's most at risk for this?
Sure. Well, anyone who's not immune can contract hepatitis A, but there are some people who are at an increased risk. People who are in direct contact with someone who has hepatitis A, travelers to countries where hepatitis A is common, men who have sexual contact with other men, people who are experiencing homelessness, people who use injection or non-injection drugs, and household members or caregivers of a recent adoptee from somewhere where hepatitis A is common are some of our most at-risk groups.
Yeah, and how does hepatitis A differ from hepatitis B or hepatitis C, other ones that people are probably very familiar with?
Sure. Well, hepatitis A, B, and liver infections that are caused by different viruses. The symptoms are pretty similar, but they have different modes of transmission. Hepatitis B and C are primarily transmitted through blood-to-blood contact. However, hepatitis A is an acute infection, which means it's a short-term infection and does not become chronic or long-term. And hepatitis B and C become chronic in some people, and the infection never completely goes away. There are vaccines to prevent hepatitis A, but there is no vaccine for hepatitis B currently.
Yeah. So in the past few years, we've seen outbreaks pop up all over the country. And like I said in the intro, since last year, Florida started reporting an increase in hepatitis A cases. Andrea, what do we know about the outbreak in Florida?
Well, we know that between January 1st, 2018 and May 18th, 2019, Florida has reported 1,768 cases of hepatitis A. The counties reporting the most cases are Pinellas with 357, Pasco with 300, Orange with 193, and Hillsborough with 180. The median age of a case is 39 years old, and 66% of the cases are male. 81% of the cases identify as white and non-Hispanic, and the most commonly reported risk factor is drug use, reported among 54% of cases. And the next most common risk factor is homelessness, which is reported among 18% of cases.
Yeah, and as you mentioned in your answer, and because we're based out of the Tampa Bay area, Pinellas, Pasco, and Hillsborough have seen the most cases. Do we know why this area has been affected so heavily as compared to other parts of the state?
No, currently we don't know why these counties are more affected than other areas of the state. What we do know is that persons who have certain risk factors, particularly drug use and homelessness, are at an increased risk.
Now, you're with the DOH. What is the DOH doing to battle this outbreak?
Yeah, our county health departments are working hard to investigate all of the cases that are reported, to identify risk factors and enact control measures to attempt to prevent the spread of the disease. And they're also working to conduct vaccination outreaches to our at-risk groups in homeless shelters, in drug treatment facilities, going to county jails, and other community organizations that provide services to these at-risk populations.
All right. So piggybacking on the vaccine topic, can you talk more about the hepatitis A vaccine? Like for the average listener who may not be familiar with it, how many shots are there? How effective is it? Is it safe?
Sure. So the hepatitis A vaccine is a 2-dose series, and the doses are given 6 months apart. It's recommended for all children at age 1 year of age. It's also recommended for persons experiencing homelessness or in unstable housing, men who have sexual contact with men, persons who use drugs, travelers to countries where hepatitis A is common, close contacts of persons who have hepatitis A, and others who are at an increased risk of infection. And it's also recommended for anybody who wants to obtain immunity. It's very safe, and there have been no serious side effects reported with the vaccine, and it's also very effective. 2 doses are nearly 100% effective in preventing infection.
Yeah. So it's really good stuff, and it's definitely highly recommended. Andrea, what else can you tell residents of this area? What can they do to prevent infection other than vaccination?
Well, in addition to getting vaccinated, hand washing is very important, not just to prevent hepatitis A, but to prevent other infections as well. If you've been exposed to someone with hepatitis A or you have symptoms, you should see a medical provider immediately. A vaccination within 14 days of exposure to someone with hepatitis A can actually help to prevent infection.
Okay. And close it out. Any final thoughts on hepatitis A, the Florida outbreak, the national outbreak, anything?
Yes, if you're concerned about hepatitis A, or if you don't know you've been vaccinated, you can talk to your doctor or contact your local county health department for more information. But the best way to prevent hepatitis A infection is to get vaccinated.
Good advice. I want to thank you, Andrea Leapley, for sharing this information with the audience today. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Okay, so important stuff. We have this outbreak going on in the state, and like Andrea said, it's very heavily congested right here in the Tampa Bay area. So check with your doctor and get some advice. Now, recently I had the chance to talk to the lead author of a new study published in The Lancet Infectious Diseases. And this study identifies the counties in the United States with the highest risk for a measles outbreak, based on, of course, on their analysis. His name is Sahotra Sarkar, PhD, and he's from UT Austin. And I wanted to go ahead and play this clip for you. It's a pretty good interview. Let's go ahead and take a listen to that, Michael.
Dr. Sarkar, welcome to the show, sir.
Thank you. I'm happy to be on it.
Thank you. The number of measles cases obviously continue to rise in the U.S. What are the main factors that are contributing to this resurgence of measles in the U.S.?
The most important factor is the low vaccination rate in the U.S., which is a result of the increasing prominence of the anti-vaccination movement all over the country and its success in many states. The second one, of course, is international travel, high volume of international travelers coming in from areas of the world where outbreaks are occurring, and large outbreaks right now are occurring in many, many countries. In the last 2 years, Europe has been one of the big centers with a huge outbreak ongoing in Ukraine, as well as outbreaks in France and Italy, all of them also caused by vaccine refusal. We are also exporting cases from the Philippines where a large outbreak is taking place, and there's a great amount of measles activity in China and India, which are also contributing to travelers bringing the virus into the U.S.
Right.
Now, when travelers bring this virus into the U.S. and there are local pockets of vaccine refusal, as in Brooklyn, New York, that's where we see the gigantic outbreaks.
Right. So with these factors in mind, how did you conduct your analysis to predict which areas of the U.S. are most at risk?
What we did was build what is called a risk function, which takes into account the vaccine refusal rate in a particular county in the U.S., the population of the county, which says something about the density and how many people the disease might spread to if the disease enters it, as well as the size, the passenger volume coming from a country, along with the measles incidence rate in that foreign country, which would be very high when an outbreak happens. When you put all of those four factors together, you can rank all the counties in the U.S., and then we took the top 25 of those and analyzed those more deeply. And in some cases, clearly, vaccine refusal was the dominant factor. In others, travel was the dominant factor. And in some cases, both were involved. In the case of Florida, both were involved, but travel clearly is a very, very important factor.
Right. So what did you find? Which areas are at the top of your list of areas most at risk?
Of the areas the ones I want to emphasize really are the ones at the very top, and these are Cook County, Chicago, because of the presence of O'Hare Airport, and then the other one that I typically emphasize is Los Angeles, again because of high amount of international travel, and because until about a year ago, California wasn't one of the states that allowed vaccine refusal, which ended about 2 years ago after they had the massive outbreak in 2014 and 2015.
Yeah, and I'm based out of Florida, and there's really several areas of Florida that are in your top 25.
That's right. And all of these are and in the case of Florida, both a low vaccination rate compared to other states that don't allow philosophical exemptions, coupled with the large number of international travelers that's playing a role in creating high risk.
Okay. Now, this risk analysis that you've done, this can really be used for other vaccine-preventable diseases, right?
Yes. We just would have to replace the incidence rates. The vaccine refusal number is more or less going to remain the same because the people who refuse the MMR vaccine for measles also typically refuse all the other vaccines. But what would vary is the activity with respect to the disease in a foreign country and the disease being brought in from that foreign country. Yeah. But right now, measles is the highest risk because there's so many outbreaks and going on all around the world.
Right. Okay, perfect. It was a very interesting study. Any final thoughts on it?
No, I'm willing to answer questions, but I don't have more to add to this.
Okay, perfect. And for the listening audience, I'll link to the study on the website when I publish the podcast. And I want to thank you, Dr. Sarkar, for your time and sharing your research with us. I appreciate it.
Okay, thank you very much, and best of luck.
All right, well, some international news. The World Health Organization announced on Monday that 2 additional countries have been certified as malaria-free. That's Algeria, which is in Africa, and Argentina in South America. Now, Algeria is the second country in the African region to be officially recognized as malaria-free. This is after Mauritius was back in 1973. As far as South America, Argentina is the second country in that area to be certified in 45 years. But Paraguay was certified last year. They both reported their last local transmission in 2013 and 2010, respectively. The Director General of the World Health Organization, Dr. Tedros, he said, quote, "Last year, Uzbekistan and Paraguay received certification as malaria-free countries. And this assembly will be joined by Argentina and Algeria. Congratulations to both countries." So it is very, very big news getting rid of malaria. Their success serves as a model for other countries working to end this disease once and for all. Now, the WHO certification is granted when a country proves that it has interrupted indigenous or local transmission of a disease for at least 3 years. Malaria, as most people know, is you get it from a mosquito bite, right? It's a mosquito-borne parasite, and it can be very serious depending on the species. And people typically have fever and chills and flu-like illness, and if it's left untreated, more severe complications can happen, and many people die in the world. In 2017, it's estimated that 219 million cases of malaria occurred worldwide. 435,000 people died, and that was primarily children in Africa. Well, the Ebola outbreak in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, it just continues to roll on, and it's just chaos over there. And I actually did a YouTube video on this, and I encourage you to check it out. It's why isn't cable news covering this, right? They're on 24/7. Why are they not covering this? Well, as of Wednesday, the latest numbers that I got, the outbreak total is already at 1,866 cases, and the vast majority of those have been confirmed. And the death toll is over 1,200. So it's a big, big outbreak. It is the second largest outbreak since the first one was determined back in 1976. Now, in his keynote speech that marked the opening of the World Health Assembly in Geneva on Monday, Director General Tedros had these following words about the Ebola outbreak to share, and I want to share them with you here. And he said, "We can be proud of the fact that so far, the outbreak has not spread outside 2 provinces in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. But I emphasize, so far, the risk of spread remains very high. Because this outbreak is one of the most complex, key word there, right? Health emergencies any of us have ever faced. We are fighting one of the world's most dangerous viruses in one of the world's most dangerous areas. We are fighting with even better tools than we used to extinguish the Equator outbreak in 3 months." Now, the Equator outbreak, if you don't recall, was the outbreak that was from last year that ended like about a week before this current outbreak started. It's a different part of the DRC. Dr. Tedros continues, "So far, we have vaccinated more than 120,000 people, and we now have evidence that the vaccine is more than 97% effective in preventing Ebola. We also have 4 experimental treatments that we've used to treat 800 patients." And this is where it kind of gets murky, right? Because this is, as he said earlier, this is a very complex outbreak. He says, "We are not just fighting a virus. We are fighting insecurity. We are fighting violence. We're fighting misinformation. And we're fighting mistrust. We're fighting the politicization of an outbreak," right? Since January, there have been dozens of attacks on health facilities in North Kivu. Every attack disrupts our operations. Every attack makes it harder to reach communities. Every attack gives the virus an advantage and a disadvantage to the responders. So yeah, very key stuff. And as we've seen, there's a lot of health workers, people that are on burial teams over there in the DRC that are being attacked by the community, or even worse, these armed thugs, on a more regular basis all the time. So this outbreak is so unique compared to anything we've seen before. Prior to the 2014, the 2016 West Africa outbreak, it was primarily in more rural areas in different parts of Africa, mostly like Central and Eastern Africa. And what the countries would do is they would pretty much cordon the place off, and the virus would eventually burn itself out. 2014, we saw something totally different, right? We saw, the first outbreak in West Africa. So that was different. And we saw this more urbanization, people traveling from city to city. So it affected 3 countries right there on the West Coast. And of course, Nigeria, they were dealing with the outbreak too, but Nigeria has experience, and they squashed it pretty well. Thank goodness, right? You have a city, Lagos, Nigeria, with, 20-something million people. That thing could have sparked like kindling, but Nigeria did a fantastic job. But it was different, you know. It was urban, and it was people moving from town to town. Now, what's different about this one is we have all this incredible civil unrest and that kind of stuff going on here in the North Kivu area of Democratic Republic of the Congo. And it's just making the work that much more difficult. So, yeah, got to keep an eye on this, and we got to get more awareness of this. You got to get people on cable news. They're on 24/7. Talk about news. This is a very, very important stuff we need to be talking about. Now, the Brigham Young University put out an interesting study, and it's about vaccine hesitancy. And a big topic, especially today with all the anti-vax movement going on, and people are seeing a lot of stuff, and they're concerned. And of course, we're dealing with this massive outbreak for U.S. standards here in the country with 880 individual cases so far, the most in like 25 years. So it is a big outbreak here, and it doesn't show much sign of slowing. And a lot of this is due to people that choose not to vaccinate, or themselves or their children. So overcoming this vaccine hesitancy is a big concern for health agencies, health departments, the government in general. And they've tried all kinds of approaches to convince anti-vaxxers to change their minds, including mandating vaccinations in some communities. And we've seen that up in the New York area. But researchers at BYU and their students were looking for a better way to increase the support for vaccinations, and they did it by doing this. They're exposing people to the pain and suffering caused by vaccine-preventable diseases instead of trying to combat the people with vaccine facts. BYU professor Brian Poole said, he's a professor of microbiology and molecular biology, vaccines are victims of their own success. They're so effective that most people have no experience with vaccine-preventable diseases. We need to reacquaint people with the dangers of those diseases, and that's really what they decided to do. So what they did is him and his team designed an intervention pool of college students in Provo, Utah. And that city happens to have one of the highest rankings of under-vaccinated kindergartners. And the hope was to improve vaccine attitudes and uptake with future parents. So they went ahead and looked at this, and in the study, half of the students were asked to interview someone who experienced a vaccine-preventable disease like polio, while the other half, which is essentially the control group, interviewed someone with an autoimmune disease. Some students were also enrolled in courses that contain intense immune and vaccine-related curriculum, while others were enrolled in a course with no vaccine curriculum. And one student actually interviewed a member of their church congregation who had shingles, recalling, quote, the pain was so bad that she ended up in a pain management clinic where they did steroid shots into her spine. The pain meds didn't even touch her pain, even the heavy ones. For months, she couldn't leave the house. Another student interviewed her grandmother who suffered from tuberculosis. And the student said of the experience, I dislike the idea of physical suffering. So hearing about someone getting a disease made the idea of getting a disease, if I don't get vaccinated, seem more real. So the researchers found that about 70% of the students who interviewed someone with a vaccine-preventable disease moved from the vaccine hesitant category to the pro-vaccine category by the end of the study, even when they had no vaccine curriculum, right? They had no vaccine education. They were just hearing these stories of the pain and suffering these people went through with these diseases. And overall, 75% of the vaccine hesitant students increased their vaccine attitude scores, with 50% of those students moving fully into the pro-vaccine attitude. So Poole goes on to say, if your goal is to affect people's decisions about vaccines, this process works much better than trying to combat anti-vaccine information. And you got to remember, these people are well tooled and they are well organized. And it's a tough sell. It really is. Poole goes on to say it shows people that these diseases really are serious diseases with painful and financial cost, and people need to take them seriously. So, yeah, good study. I encourage you to check that out at Brigham Young University. Really good stuff. And today we see that FDA cleared a couple new tests in the United States. They authorized marketing for a new Zika IgM test. So that's exciting news. And then they cleared 2 tests for chlamydia and gonorrhea testing, but it's for the samples for throats and rectal samples. So that's big news there coming out of the FDA. Okay, up against the hard break. After the break, hurricane preparedness with Mike Coston. See you then.
Welcome back to Outbreak News This Week, your source for all the news about worms and germs. Here's your host, microbiologist and editor of OutbreakNewsToday.com, Robert Harriman.
Well, welcome back to the program. And we're going to go ahead and turn away from worms and germs for a little bit. And because hurricane is just around the corner, right? June 1st is the beginning of the season. Although we've already seen a named storm in the Atlantic. So I guess my questions are you ready? What should you do to be prepared? Well, here to offer some great advice on preparation is someone who writes about it often on the website, Avian Flu Diary, Mike Coston. Hey, Mike, thanks for joining me to shed some light on hurricane preparedness.
Oh, thanks for having me, Robert.
You bet. So before we start with the preparedness aspect, do we yet know the predictions for the storm activity this year in the Atlantic?
Well, they're not predictions, but they do have an outlook. And they released it at 11 o'clock this morning. NOAA, their outlook is for a near average hurricane season. They're calling for between 9 to 15 named storms. 4 to 8 of those could be hurricanes, and 2 to 4 of those could be major hurricanes.
Okay, so that's your average hurricane season then.
That's your average hurricane.
Yeah.
But it just takes one hitting you to make it a big hurricane.
Yeah, yes, I know, and I know you're going to stress that throughout. What is the first thing that listeners should think about concerning preparedness? What would you say?
I think that your listeners ought to think about preparedness like being ready to do unscheduled camping. Because basically that's what it's all about. At some point, the power will be out for a day or maybe a week or longer. And you may have to camp in your living room or in your backyard or a neighbor's house. So if you think about preparedness like thinking about preparing to go camping, you're way ahead of the curve.
So is it kind of like setting up an initial plan based on the different risk?
Well, somewhat, but we really stress all risk preparedness, meaning you don't want to just focus on hurricanes because we live in hurricane country, because other things can happen here. So you want to prepare for long-term power outages, because that comes with almost every natural disaster. You want to prepare for not being able to get food from the grocery store. After Irma hit here 2 years ago, the grocery stores in my town were empty and stayed that way for a week after the storm passed. So you need to think about being able to spend the next week or 10 days pretty much camping and fending for yourself.
What would you say about the importance about understanding and knowing the evacuation routes? And what do Florida state health officials or Florida state officials say when it comes to evacuations?
Well, you want to listen to your local emergency management. The National Hurricane Center is where you should go for information about where the storm is headed, how strong it's likely to be, that sort of thing. But it's your local county emergency management office that is going to be giving you instructions as to whether you should evacuate and what routes you should take. And so you should go to your county EOC website, and they will have evacuation maps and flood zone maps and that sort of thing for your location. I would also stress having a weather radio so that you can get the NOAA broadcast, because if the local radio stations are out, the government stations are more likely to be broadcasting.
Now, if you do have to evacuate, having a list of important phone numbers and contacts is probably something you want to have. What kind of phone numbers and contacts should we have as we pack up our bug out bag and take off?
Well, first off, it would be good to have a contact that everybody in your family knows that phone number to call as a central point. And that person ought to be out of the area so that they're not impacted by the storm. So if you get separated from members of your family, everybody knows to call Uncle Ed in Cincinnati and leave a message. With social media, that can be done on Facebook, and there are Red Cross apps out there that let you do this notification of friends and family that I'm alive, I'm safe, and here I am. But you really want to have a communications plan with your entire family and with friends, because the cell phones could be down, internet could be down, and you may be separated from your loved ones. So having some common link-up points, even if it's a Facebook page or a relative in another state, to leave a message is important.
Now, of course, supplies are always a key issue when it comes to this, and I would venture to guess that many people are not necessarily ready. Mike, what are the basic supplies that are necessary, and how much?
The mantra from FEMA for many years was every household should have 72 hours worth of emergency supplies. The problem with that is that, as we've seen with Katrina and with Superstorm Sandy and with Harvey and Irma, and of course Puerto Rico being without for weeks and months, is that 72 hours isn't enough. The state of Florida is calling for a minimum of 7 days supply. And they would be very happy to hear that you had 14 days. And I think that's the sweet spot. I don't think you need 3 months worth of supplies, but I do think somewhere between 7 and 14 days is achievable for most people. It may be, ramen noodles and Spam, but at least you'll be eating.
Right. And that really, piggyback on that, noodles and Spam. What are the basic supplies that everybody should have?
Well, you want canned foods that you can open and eat without having to cook. Soup, chili, ravioli, that sort of thing. Because you may not be able to cook. Most people have electric stoves. Those that have propane stoves or camp stoves and that sort of thing are going to be in a little better shape. But basically, you need food that you can just open and eat. If you have the ability to cook when the power's out, then you can be a little more adventurous in your cuisine. But I would suggest keeping it simple, keeping things like, big jars of peanut butter and boxes of crackers for snacks. It's not a bad idea to stow away a bag of candy, because at some point you're going to be awfully tired of ramen noodles.
Right.
So, and if you have kids particularly, you may want to be able to lighten their day by giving them a candy bar at some point 2 or 3 days into this. So you do need to think a little bit about creature comforts when you can. But most important things are, of course, water and food. And you really ought to have 1 gallon of water per person per day. So if you are a family of 4, you need 28 gallons of water, essentially, for a week.
So you're talking about canned goods. So obviously we would need a manual can opener.
Yes. can openers is very important. Although many cans, people will look for the pop top cans now.
Yeah.
You also can find a lot of these shelf stable meals. Arbor makes complete meals, that sort of thing, and they're usually $2 or so a piece. You can eat those cold if you had to.
And what are your thoughts about going to these emergency websites that sell MREs and freeze-dried food and all that?
You have to understand that MREs are all right for a few days, but they are difficult to digest over the long term. They're very expensive, as is freeze-dried. Now, if you can afford freeze-dried food, it's not a terrible idea, but you're going to be paying $7, $8, $10 a meal for freeze-dried food. And MREs are usually $7 or so a piece. That gets pretty pricey. So it's not a terrible solution, but there are better solutions out there.
Yeah.
It's like you're not going to buy 28 gallons of water in bottles, or you shouldn't. You ought to be storing water now in food-safe containers and having them on hand instead of at the last minute saying, oh, my goodness, I have to go out and buy 28 gallons of bottled water. Well, you're going to be in a long line and you're unlikely to get it.
So what about supplies other than food and water? What do you recommend people have available, particularly if you have to evacuate?
Well, a bug-out bag, which is basically a bag that has room for a change of clothes, medicines you may need to take, copies of your important papers, which ought to be put in a plastic bag or a waterproof pouch. Everybody should have one of those. Then you should have a bigger bin or box or whatever of your communal supplies, things like canned food, first aid kit, that sort of thing. Most people won't be bugging out on foot, so hopefully they'll be, in a vehicle or that sort of thing.
And you mentioned important papers. What papers are you talking about? Insurance papers, or what are you talking about?
Insurance papers. It's actually not a bad idea to take photos of your driver's license, your credit card, your birth certificate, that sort of thing, and keep all these things on a thumb drive so that you can have your important papers. I scan most of my important papers and put them on a thumb drive that, goes into my bug out bag so that I have a copy of pretty much everything I need if I can get to a computer.
Okay. Now, what about special and medical needs? If you got to evacuate with your elderly grandmother, or if you yourself have a special medical need, any recommendations for that?
Well, first you need to determine whether there are any shelters that are going to be open that will take special needs people. And these could be people that need oxygen or require CPAP or simply are not ambulatory enough to evacuate normally. You should call your emergency local emergency management office and find out what is available. And in many cases, you need to register so that they can set aside a space for you and your family at these special shelters.
And of course, if you're on any particular medicines, that you need to take that. And
it's kind of tough because although for years the AMA and FEMA have recommended everybody have a 30-day supply of extra medicine, getting that done with insurance isn't always easy. But yes, it's important to have, if you're on cardiac medications, blood pressure medications, whatever it happens to be, that you have enough to get you through for a couple of weeks. After Katrina, I don't want to tell a war story, but my brother was in New Orleans. He lived in the French Quarter. And not only was his doctor gone, his pharmacy was gone, and he couldn't get his prescription filled. And it took him 6 weeks to get a new doctor. He had to go to Nashville. So you really have to think about, do I have what I need to survive the next 2 weeks? The good news is that since Katrina, laws have been passed to allow pharmacies to dispense emergency short-term prescriptions. If you can show that you have a prescription for something, showing them the bottle, you can get a refill. So once an emergency is declared, that goes into effect in most states.
Well, that's great advice. Mike, something I'm sure a lot of listeners would be asking, what if you have pets?
Well, a lot of shelters are pet friendly. Not all of them, but a lot of them. You do not want to abandon your pets behind. There were, really tragic stories after Katrina, and basically after every hurricane, we see tragic stories of pets left behind that they just couldn't get out. The best thing is if you can arrange, and this is really the best advice I can give everybody, is make arrangements now with a friend or a relative or somebody who lives 50 or 100 miles away that will take you in for a hurricane. I write about having a disaster buddy or buddies, and these are people that will take you in during an emergency, and conversely, you'll take them in if they're the ones who've been hit.
Mm-hmm.
And it's sort of like a mutual aid situation. Basically, you'll be there and you'll have their back and they'll have your back. Knowing where you're going to go and having it already agreed upon will save you a lot of trouble and angst when the storm is approaching. When I had to evacuate 2 years ago, I knew exactly, who I was going to hit up for a couch to sleep on. And it worked out just fine.
All right, so let me fast forward now. The storm has passed, and you can go home if you did in fact evacuate. Any special things we need to know post-storm?
Well, yeah, actually quite a few.
Yeah.
First, flood waters are very dangerous. There's going to be raw sewage. There's going to be, here in Florida, there could be, snakes. There could be reptiles out, whatever. There could also be metal and glass and all sorts of debris. There's also the possibility of downed electrical wires. Now, most of them won't have power, but as they're restoring the power, you don't want to be standing in a puddle with wire. So you want to stay out of floodwaters, particularly after hurricane. Food that may have been in a refrigerator that you come home to and your fridge has been off and you don't know how long, you probably just ought to throw it away instead of taking the risk that it went bad and then the power came back on and you come back and all of a sudden it's cold, it looks good. It could be breeding salmonella or something like that. So you want to be careful about food that you return to your house. And basically, you also need to worry about, the soil will be saturated with rain. Trees may continue to fall. Branches may continue to fall off. More people get injured after the storm than during the storm. And that can go on for days or weeks. A lot of people are injured using chainsaws or, probably most famously, carbon monoxide poisoning,
mm-hmm.
which is a big deal because people are running generators or cooking with a hibachi indoors. All very bad ideas.
Well, so other than hurricanes, is your general plan set up for all kinds of disasters?
Yeah, because you don't know what's going to come down the pipe.
Mm-hmm.
When I lived in the Midwest for 10 years, I wasn't worried about hurricanes. I was worried about earthquakes because I lived within spitting distance of New Madrid, and tornadoes because I was in Tornado Alley. But we also had blizzards. It was a triple threat.
Right.
Ice storms that had you locked in for a week, that sort of thing. General disaster preparedness, yes, you live in hurricane country. If you live near the water particularly or the low-lying area, you need to have a hurricane plan. But even if you live in a well-constructed concrete block house 20 miles inland and you think you're safe from any storm, you need to have a disaster plan because you just don't know what's going to happen.
All right. Well, let me go ahead and close out this interview. Give you an open floor. Any final thoughts?
Well, what I would say is every year people get on the radio and the TV and they talk about preparedness for hurricanes. And it tends to go in one ear and out the other because most people living in Florida have never been through a really, really bad hurricane. I've lived in Florida almost my entire life, except for that brief period in the Midwest. I was born here, second generation Floridian. And although I've lost count, 12, 15 hurricanes over the last 50 years, I've never been in the core of a really, really bad hurricane. I've been in bad enough hurricanes, but even I don't know what it's really like. But what I can tell you is you do not want to find out. And you really don't want to find out when you're unprepared to deal with it. So even though you hear it every year, take it to heart. People who lived in the Panhandle last October when Hurricane Michael went from a tropical storm to a Category 5 hurricane in 48 hours learned a big lesson. And you just cannot predict what a storm is going to do. They're very good at telling you where the storm is going to go. They're not so good about telling you how strong it's going to be when it gets there. And the fact that in a late season storm off the coast of Cuba could ramp up to a Category 5 storm in 48 hours is just remarkable. Mm-hmm. So we always have to believe that you hope for the best, but you have to understand you may not get the best.
Well, great advice as always. I want to thank you, Mike Coston, for appearing on the show and informing my listeners.
My pleasure, Robert.
All right. Okay, well, with a couple minutes left in the program, I want to go ahead and go through the news a little bit on the website, outbreaknewstoday.com. And one of the stories that always breaks my heart when I have to report on it or talk about it is congenital syphilis, right? This is a highly preventable condition, and it happens because of untreated syphilis during pregnancy, and the consequences are just horrible, right? Stillbirth and blindness and deafness and skeletal deformations. So it's a horrible thing, and it's really very, very preventable. Well, over in Thailand, they just put out a report. Their public health ministry saying they've seen at least almost 250 congenital syphilis cases already this year. And the ministry's permanent secretary says syphilis is just on the rise over there generally, like it is in a lot of parts of the world, right? But through May 13th this year, they've had over 3,000 cases of syphilis. So, yeah. But that's just a horribly heartbreaking thing. And we're seeing increases right here in this country of congenital syphilis. Let me switch over to France real quick. Kind of an interesting story. We don't see these very often. The University Hospital of Rennes, and I'm sure I'm not saying that right, Rennes, they have reported 7 cases of fish tapeworm in the past 2 years. And this is something they haven't reported in before 2016, 20 years prior to that. And of course, the fish tapeworm is Diphyllobothrium latum, and they're linking that to sushi and raw fish. Kind of interesting story. Something you don't see very often in that part of the world, right? So I want to again encourage you to check out the website, outbreaknewstoday.com, outbreaknewstoday.com. We're also doing some stuff on YouTube, and you can see that at Outbreak News TV on the YouTube page. And we have a podcast, Outbreak News Interviews, which can be found on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher Radio, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and basically any other platform that you can think of. So, all right. I want to thank my guests today, Andrea Leapley, Michael Coston, and I will see you next week on Outbreak News This Week. Good day, and God bless.
Thank you for listening to Outbreak News This Week with Robert Harriman. If you missed any part of today's program, you can listen to the podcast anytime on our website, outbreaknewstoday.com. Make sure to join us here next week for Outbreak News This Week with Robert Harriman.
And don't forget to check us out at the website, outbreaknewstoday.com, the podcast, Outbreak News Interviews, which can be found on the website, on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher Radio, and Spotify, and the Outbreak News This Week radio show, which is aired Sundays at 1 p.m. Eastern Time in the Tampa Bay area on AM 1380 The Biz, or online streaming at 1380thebiz.com. And check out our social media presence, Facebook at Infectious Disease News, and Twitter at BackDman63. Outbreak News TV is a production of The Global Dispatch. Copyright The Global Dispatch Incorporated, 2019.